Why you feel guilty when you rest. The psychology of people who must earn their worth. There is a specific moment that happens to you, and almost no one talks about it. You finally have nothing urgent to do. The work is finished, or finished enough. The house is quiet. You sit down. And within about 90 seconds, something rises in your chest that feels almost exactly like shame. Not tiredness. Not boredom. Something closer to dread. A quiet voice that says, you should be doing something. You should be useful right now. And so you stand up and you find a task, and the relief that follows is immediate, and you never once question what just happened. You have probably explained this to yourself in flattering terms. You are driven. You are disciplined. You have a strong work ethic. Maybe someone told you that you just do not know how to relax, as though relaxing were a hobby you never picked up. But this is not discipline. This is not a trait you were born with. This is not restlessness, and it is not ambition. And it is certainly not the productivity mindset you were told to be proud of. What you are experiencing is a debt. Somewhere very early, you learned that your existence was conditional, that being kept, loved, praised, or left alone in peace depended on output. And a person who believes their worth is conditional cannot rest, because rest is the one state in which you produce nothing, and therefore prove nothing. Stillness becomes exposure. Doing nothing becomes being nothing. That is why the guilt arrives faster than the tiredness. That is why the vacation takes 4 days to feel bearable, and why the 5th day feels like grief. That is why you can accept almost any amount of exhaustion, but cannot accept an afternoon with no purpose. The nervous system is not confused. It is protecting you from something that once had real consequences. What follows is not a set of tips. There is no breathing exercise for this, because the problem is not in your schedule. It is in your definition of yourself. Instead, what follows traces 3 things carefully. First, the mechanism. What is actually happening inside you in the seconds between sitting down and standing back up. Second, the origin, where the contract was written, who wrote it, and why you signed it as a child without ever reading the terms. Third, the exit. What it means to build a sense of worth that does not require evidence, and why that process feels at first exactly like losing your identity. Stay with this to the end, even if the middle is uncomfortable. Especially if the middle is uncomfortable, because the discomfort you feel while reading is the same discomfort you feel while resting, and learning to remain present inside it is the entire work. The rest that never arrives. Notice how you rest. You do not stop. You switch. You finish the demanding task and immediately reach for the smaller one. You close the laptop and open your phone. You lie down and put on something educational, something that counts. Even your leisure has a justification attached. A small receipt you could produce if questioned. Documentaries instead of nothing. Walks that are also exercise. Books that improve you. Every hour is accounted for, and the accounting never stops. This is not laziness avoided. This is vigilance maintained. True rest requires a state your body has never been given clearance to enter. Unjustified existence. Time that produces nothing, improves nothing, and defends nothing. And when you approach that state, an alarm goes off, and the alarm is older than your career. Watch what happens physically. Your shoulders stay slightly raised. Your jaw does not release. You sit, but you sit like someone waiting to be called. There is a readiness in the body that does not match the situation. Because the body is not responding to your living room. It is responding to a memory of a house where being idle was noticed, where being unoccupied invited criticism, where the safest position was mid-task. You are not sitting on a couch. You are holding a posture you learned before you had language for it, and so you develop what looks like a solution. You become someone who rests by collapsing. You go until the body refuses. Illness, migraine, burnout, the flu that arrives the first weekend of every holiday. These are not coincidences. They are the only permission slips your system accepts. Sickness is rest with a valid excuse. When you cannot function, no one can accuse you of choosing not to function, and the guilt has nowhere to land. This is why some people are genuinely calmer when they are ill than when they are free. Understand what that means about the structure you are living inside. You are not a person who struggles to relax. You are a person who has to become incapable before you are allowed to stop. And the cost of that arrangement compounds quietly for years, because a system that only permits recovery through breakdown will eventually schedule the breakdowns for you. Push that one step further. If your body must fall apart before you accept stillness, then somewhere along the way your right to exist without output was taken from you, which means it was once given and then removed. So the question is not how to rest better. The question is when it stopped being free, where the debt was signed. No one sits a child down and explains the terms. That is what makes this so difficult to see later. The contract is not spoken. It is inferred over thousands of small moments by a mind built specifically to detect what keeps the people it depends on close. Reconstruct the environment, not the dramatic version, the ordinary one. Perhaps attention was scarce, distributed by achievement. Perhaps a parent was overwhelmed and calm only arrived in the house when things got done. Perhaps someone was ill, or grieving, or working 2 jobs, and you learned that the family had no spare capacity for your needs, only for your contributions. Perhaps love was warm and genuine, but it arrived most reliably in the form of praise. Perhaps you were called the responsible one, and you understood immediately that the title came with conditions. A child has no exit. That single fact explains everything that follows. When a small person senses that connection is conditional, they cannot renegotiate and they cannot walk away. So they do the only intelligent thing available. They meet the condition. They become useful. They anticipate. They achieve. And it works. The tension in the room drops, the approval arrives, and a neural pathway is carved that says clearly, output produces safety. Notice that this is not a mistake. This is competence. You solved a real problem with the only tool a child has, which is self-modification. The tragedy is not that you adapted. The tragedy is that adaptations do not expire on their own. The strategy that earned you a place at 8 years old is still running at 35, and it does not know the environment changed because it was never designed to check. So you carry a debt with no principal and no creditor. There is nothing to pay off because the amount owed was never a number, it was a condition of belonging. And a debt like that has a particular quality. Every payment reduces the anxiety for a few hours and increases the interest rate for a lifetime. Each achievement confirms the theory that achievement is what keeps you safe. Carry this with you as we go deeper. The guilt you feel when you rest is not irrational. It is a memory functioning exactly as designed, warning you about a danger that was once real and is now only structural. And that raises something harder. Because if the debt is not about work at all, then the child who signed it must still be somewhere inside the arrangement, still working, still waiting to be told it is enough. The child who learned to deliver. There is a version of you, quite young, who discovered that performance was more reliable than affection. Affection fluctuated. It depended on other people's moods, capacities, and histories, none of which you controlled. Results did not fluctuate. A finished task, a good grade, a chore completed before anyone had to ask, produced a response you could predict almost to the word. So you stopped waiting to be given something and started producing something instead, and everyone agreed that you were mature for your age. Look closely at how that child operated. They finished things before being asked, because anticipation earned more than obedience. They kept an internal list and never allowed it to empty, because an empty list meant an unaccounted hour. They noticed which of their outputs drew the strongest response and quietly produced more of that one. They became remarkably skilled at converting effort into approval, and remarkably unskilled at wanting anything that converted into neither. Ask that child what they would do with a free afternoon, and the question would have confused them, and then they would have found something useful to do with it. That child is not a metaphor. That child is the part of you that feels a jolt of anxiety when someone says we need to talk. That is the part that apologizes for taking up time. That is the part that hears a compliment and immediately calculates how to maintain it. And crucially, that is the part that experiences rest as abandonment of duty, because for them, Duty was the relationship. Take away the usefulness, and there is no visible reason for anyone to stay. Here is what almost no one recognizes. This person is often deeply admired, reliable, impressive, the one who holds things together. The world rewards this adaptation generously, which is precisely why it never gets examined. A wound that produces praise looks like a strength, and no one questions a strength. So you get promoted for the exact behavior that is slowly eroding you, and every reward tightens the knot. And underneath the competence there is a specific loneliness, one you have probably never said out loud. What people know about you is your record, what you deliver, how reliably, at what standard, under what pressure. They have never met the version of you on a week when nothing was produced, because you have never allowed that version into a room, because you are convinced it is unlovable. You have not tested that belief. You have organized your entire life around avoiding the test, which raises a harder question. If you have spent decades proving your value through what you produce, how would you even recognize being valued for something else? What would it feel like, and would you believe it? Productivity as an apology. Consider the possibility that your work is not ambition. It is an apology delivered repeatedly for existing without prior authorization. Watch the pattern in the details. You over-deliver on things nobody asked you to do well. You respond to messages faster than anyone requires. You feel a compulsion to explain your reasoning even when no one is doubting it. You add unnecessary justifications to simple requests. Sorry to bother you, just wondering if, whenever you have time, no rush at all. Each of those phrases is a small payment. You are apologizing for occupying space in someone's attention. The tell is how you feel after praise. A person with unconditional worth receives praise and feels warmth. You receive praise and feel a deadline. The approval does not settle in you as evidence of value. It registers as an expectation to maintain, a new floor beneath which you must never fall. This is why success does not calm you. Success raises the standard you must now defend. The relief lasts an afternoon. The obligation lasts years. And notice the asymmetry in how you process outcomes. Achievements are attributed to circumstance, timing, luck, or the help of others. Failures are attributed to your character. Good work is what you owed. Bad work is who you are. This is not humility, although it wears humility's clothes very convincingly. Humility is an accurate sense of scale. What you have is a system in which credit cannot be received and blame cannot be shared, and that system is not modest. It is punishing. There is also a quieter cost, harder to see. When your work is an apology, you lose the ability to know what you actually want to do. Desire requires a self that is allowed to want things for no reason. But every impulse in you gets filtered through a single question. Is this justified? Would this hold up if someone asked? So preferences atrophy. You become extraordinarily capable and strangely absent from your own life. Excellent at execution and blank when asked what you would choose if nothing had to be earned. Notice what this actually means. If your productivity is an apology, then it can never be accepted, because an apology for existing has no possible acceptance. There is no amount of output that retroactively authorizes a life, and a payment that can never clear the debt does not stop the body from trying. It just moves the effort somewhere you cannot see it. The body that cannot stand down. The nervous system does not deal in concepts. It deals in threat and safety, and it has learned something specific about you. Unoccupied time precedes danger. That is why the physical symptoms make no sense on paper. You are lying down, warm, safe, with nothing scheduled, and your heart is slightly fast. Your thoughts accelerate rather than slow. You feel a low buzzing agitation that you interpret as needing to do something. Some people describe it as itching from the inside. Others describe it as guilt with no content, a sense of wrongdoing with no crime attached. What you are feeling is a threat response firing in the absence of any threat, because for your system, the absence of activity is the threat. Understand the mechanism. During activity, attention points outward, at tasks, at other people's needs, at problems to be solved. Activity is not only how you earn safety, it is also how you avoid interiority. The moment you stop, attention has nowhere to go but inward. And inward is where the unmetabolized material lives. The old fear of not being enough. The grief that was never permitted. The anger you were not allowed to have. Rest is not restful, because rest is where you finally meet yourself, and you were trained to believe that self was insufficient. This explains something that confuses many people, including therapists who have not seen the pattern clearly. Some people become more anxious the more they rest, at least at first. Holiday anxiety, Sunday dread, the strange despair of the second week of leave. It is not that rest is bad for you. It is that rest removes the anesthetic, and what surfaces was always there, held down by motion. There is also a hard physiological reality. A body running on chronic activation pays with sleep that does not restore, digestion that misbehaves, jaws worn down at night, immune systems that surrender the moment pressure drops. You have likely normalized all of it. You may have described yourself as someone who just needs less sleep, or who has a sensitive stomach, or who gets sick easily. Those are not traits. Those are invoices. Sit with what that implies. Your body has been arguing with you for years using the only language it has, and you have interpreted every message as a personal failing to push through. So what would happen if you stopped translating its signals as weakness and considered that the exhaustion is not the problem to be overcome, but the evidence of the arrangement you are living inside? Why praise feels like a deadline? Most people assume the cure for conditional worth is more validation. Get enough recognition and the hole fills. You have run that experiment, you know how it ends. Here is the structural reason it fails. Praise is information about performance. It says, what you produced met or exceeded a standard. It cannot say, you would be valuable if you produced nothing. The two statements live in different categories, and no quantity of the first ever becomes the second, so you can receive genuine, well-earned, heartfelt recognition and remain exactly as hungry as before, because the thing you need cannot be delivered in that currency. Worse, praise raises the cost of stopping. Once you are the reliable one, the impressive one, the one who always delivers, you now have a reputation to service. And a reputation is a debt with a public register. Every success narrows the range of acceptable future behavior. This is why so many high-performing people describe a private sense of being trapped by their own competence. They built a life that only functions if they never stop, and they built it out of things everyone congratulated them for. Notice the specific fear underneath. It is not fear of failure exactly. It is fear of being ordinary. Because if your value is your output, then average output means average value, and average value means, in the internal logic you inherited, invisibility. To be unremarkable is to be unloved. So mediocrity is not a mild disappointment for you. It is an existential threat, and that is why you cannot let yourself have a slow month. And there is a second fear, quieter and more painful. Part of you suspects that if you ever fully rested, if you dropped the performance and let people see the unimpressive interior, they would leave. Not dramatically. They would simply become less interested. This suspicion feels like realism. It is not. It is a hypothesis formed in childhood by someone who had very limited data and no ability to test it, and it has been running unchallenged ever since. Follow this carefully, because it is the point where the pattern becomes self-sealing. If you only ever show the version of you that produces, then every relationship you have will confirm that the produced version is what people want, and the confirmation will feel like proof. You are not gathering evidence about your worth. You are gathering evidence about your mask, and the guilt is what happens when you consider taking it off. The guilt that arrives before the rest does. Pay attention to the timing. The guilt does not come after a long stretch of idleness. It arrives almost immediately, sometimes before you have even sat down, sometimes at the exact moment you decide to stop. That timing tells you what it actually is. Guilt, properly speaking, is a response to harm caused. You feel it when you have violated a value that matters to you. But there is no harm here. Nobody is damaged by your sitting still on a Tuesday afternoon. So this emotion has the shape of guilt and none of the content, which means it is not guilt at all. It is a learned prohibition wearing guilt's face. It is the internalized voice of an environment that once needed you productive, still doing its job long after the environment dissolved. That is why arguing with it does not work. You have tried the reasonable approach. You have told yourself that you have earned this, that everyone needs rest, that you worked 11 days straight. And the feeling does not care because it was not built by reasoning and cannot be dismantled by it. You are attempting to negotiate with a smoke detector. Notice also what the prohibition wants you to do. It wants you to move. And when you move, it rewards you instantly with relief, which is precisely why the pattern is so durable. This is a compulsion loop, structurally identical to any other. Discomfort rises, you perform the ritual, the discomfort drops, and the belief that the ritual was necessary gets stronger. Every time you stand up to do one small task, you teach yourself that stillness was genuinely dangerous. Decades of that produces a person who literally cannot sit down, which means the work is not to feel less guilty before resting. That order never comes. The guilt will not clear the way for you, because it can only weaken through disconfirmation, and disconfirmation requires you to remain still while it screams. You have to rest badly, guiltily, uncomfortably, hundreds of times, until the alarm gathers evidence that nothing happens. Consider what that costs in the short term. It means choosing an hour of psychological discomfort over an hour of productive relief, on purpose, with nothing to show for it afterward. And it raises the question of why you would ever choose that, unless you understood clearly what the alternative arrangement has actually been charging you. The ledger that never closes. Somewhere in you there is a ledger, and it has been open your entire adult life. You do not consciously maintain it, but you can consult it instantly. Ask yourself right now whether you have done enough today, and notice that an answer appears without any calculation. That speed tells you the accounting is continuous. The ledger has strange rules. Nothing carries over. Yesterday's productivity earns you no credit today. The balance resets at midnight, permanently at zero. Small failures are recorded in detail and retained indefinitely. Achievements are logged briefly, then discounted as expected. And there is no line item for anything you are, only for things you did. Kindness counts if it required effort. Presence does not count at all. Notice who else appears in this ledger. You track what people have done for you with uncomfortable precision, and you feel the imbalance physically until you have repaid it. Someone buys you lunch and you carry it. Someone helps you move and you cannot rest until you have offered something equivalent. You experience receiving as debt accumulation, which is why generosity aimed at you produces anxiety rather than warmth. You are not ungrateful. You are unable to hold credit. This is the deepest cost, and it is not exhaustion. It is that you cannot be given anything. Love arriving as a gift cannot be processed by a system built for transactions, so it gets converted into obligation on arrival. Someone tells you they love you, and part of you starts calculating how to deserve it. Someone stays with you through a difficult period, and you feel indebted, rather than held. You have been surrounded, possibly for years, by care you were structurally incapable of receiving, and there is a quieter loss layered underneath. A person keeping a ledger cannot be spontaneous, cannot be silly, cannot waste an afternoon, cannot want something purely because they want it. All of that requires an unaudited self. So the parts of you that were never useful, the strange interests, the pointless delights, the whole unproductive interior, went undeveloped. Not destroyed, just never watered. Sit with the scale of that for a moment. It is not simply that you have been working too hard. It is that an entire dimension of your life, the receiving dimension, has been closed since childhood. So what happens the first time you deliberately hold it open and refuse to pay? What happens when you finally stop? It is worth knowing in advance because most people who attempt this interpret the experience as evidence that something is wrong with them, and they quit within a week. The first thing that comes is not peace. It is agitation, sharp and physical, and it usually peaks somewhere between 20 minutes and 2 days depending on how thoroughly you have committed. Your mind will generate an impressive list of urgent tasks, and they will feel genuinely urgent. This is not a coincidence of timing. This is your system doing what it has always done to end the discomfort, manufacturing legitimate reasons to move. If you stay, the second thing arrives, and it is heavier. Sadness with no clear object, a sense of loss that seems disproportionate to sitting quietly in a room. What is surfacing is grief, and it has been waiting a long time. Grief for the childhood in which you had to be useful. Grief for the years of relationships in which you were valued for function. Grief, most sharply, for the version of you who never got to be a child with nothing required of them. Motion was keeping that at a distance, and stillness lets it through. The third thing is the strangest, and it is the one people are least prepared for. A temporary loss of identity. If you have been the reliable one, the achiever, the one who holds it together, then removing the output removes the answer to who you are. And that emptiness feels like annihilation rather than freedom. Many people describe it as feeling like a fraud, or like nobody, or like they have disappeared. It passes, but only if you tolerate it long enough to discover that something remains when the function is subtracted. And here is what appears after that, quietly and without ceremony. Preferences. Small, genuine wants with no justification attached. A wish to look out a window. A curiosity about something useless. A desire to see a specific person for no reason. These are the first signals of a self that operates outside the ledger, and they are easy to miss because they are so unimpressive compared to the achievements you are used to measuring by. Which means the process is not restful at all, at least not at first. And that explains something important. You may have tried this before and concluded that you are simply not built for rest. What if you were not failing? What if you were arriving exactly on schedule at the part everyone else turns back from? The people who benefit from your exhaustion. There is a dimension to this that goes beyond your own history, and it deserves naming plainly, because keeping it invisible is part of how the pattern persists. Someone benefits when a person cannot rest, not always maliciously. Often no one has designed it at all. But a workplace with one person who absorbs the overflow does not need to hire, and it will not notice the gap until that person breaks. A family with one member who manages everything does not have to distribute the load. A friendship group with one person who always organizes never has to learn. Your inability to stop is quietly load-bearing for other people's comfort, and systems do not voluntarily surrender a load-bearing wall. This produces a specific experience you have probably had and struggled to explain. When you begin to set limits, people who genuinely care about you become subtly displeased. Not cruel, just cooler, slightly disappointed. There is a comment about how you have changed, a joke about you getting soft, a suggestion that you seem less committed lately. And you take that as confirmation of your worst belief, that you are only valued for what you produce. Sometimes that is accurate. Often it is simply a system adjusting to lost capacity, and adjustment always feels like disapproval from the inside. Notice, too, that your culture rewards this wound directly. Busyness is discussed as virtue. Exhaustion is presented as evidence of significance. Ask anyone how they are and listen for the pride in the word busy. If you grew up believing that worth is earned, you did not have to fight your environment, you were promoted by it, and every promotion made the belief harder to question. But be careful with this observation, because there is a trap in it. Recognizing that others benefit from your overwork can become another reason to focus outward, on their unfairness, on their failure to notice. That is still motion. That is still avoiding the interior. The uncomfortable truth is that no external permission is coming. There is no manager, parent, or partner who will one day tell you that you have done enough and may now stop. If you wait for that sentence, you will wait your entire life. Carry that with you into what comes next because it changes the nature of the task. If nobody is going to authorize your rest, then the authorization has to be issued by you, before you feel entitled to it, and without any of the proof you have always required. Rest without permission. So what does this actually look like, practically, for someone whose body treats stillness as a threat? Not affirmations, not a better morning routine. Something considerably smaller and considerably harder. It begins with unjustified time. Not scheduled self-care, which is still an item completed. Not productive rest, which is still payment. Time that produces nothing and cannot be reported. 10 minutes is enough to start, and 10 minutes will feel like a great deal. The instruction is simple and almost unbearable. Sit, do nothing, and let the guilt arrive without obeying it. You are not trying to feel calm. You are demonstrating to your nervous system that the alarm can sound and nothing follows. The second practice is naming the voice accurately. When the pressure rises, most people say I should be working. Try instead. Something in me believes I will not be safe unless I produce. That sentence does two things. It separates you from the prohibition, which was previously indistinguishable from your own judgment, and it exposes the claim as a belief rather than a fact. Beliefs can be examined. Facts cannot. The third is the harder practice, and it is the one that actually shifts the foundation. Receiving without repaying. Let someone do something for you, and deliberately do not balance it. No return favor, no immediate reciprocation, no verbal offsetting. Say thank you and sit in the discomfort of holding credit. This will feel worse than it sounds. It is also the only way to teach a transactional system that connection is not a trade, and it works precisely because nothing is exchanged. Expect regression, and plan for how you will interpret it. There will be weeks where you overwork with total commitment, and afterward, you will be tempted to conclude that nothing has changed. Nothing works that way. What actually changes first is not the behavior, it is the recognition. You will notice yourself standing up to find a task, and for the first time you will know what you are doing while you do it. That gap between impulse and identification is where the entire transformation lives, and it opens long before the impulse weakens. Notice what all three practices share. None of them require you to feel differently first. They ask you to act against a belief while it is still fully operational, and that leads somewhere specific, because if you succeed in receiving without repaying, you will eventually have to face what it means to be loved for nothing at all. Learning to be loved unproductively. This is the part that people avoid, and they avoid it for a reason. Being loved unproductively is not a reward at the end of the process. It is the most exposed position available to a human being. Understand why. As long as you are valued for what you provide, you retain control. You can improve, work harder, become more indispensable. There is always a lever. Being loved for nothing removes every lever. It means the other person could simply stop, for reasons you cannot influence and cannot prevent by being better. Conditional worth is exhausting, but it is also a strategy. Unconditional worth is peaceful, and it is completely defenseless. So notice what you do when someone gets close to loving the unproductive parts of you. You deflect the compliment. You change the subject. You perform a small service to restore the balance. You explain why they are wrong about you, or you find fault with them subtly until the intimacy is manageable again. None of this is dishonesty. It is a protective reflex from someone who learned that being seen without a function preceded loss. And there is a specific loneliness that comes with being loved only for output, one that survives every amount of admiration. You can be surrounded by people who value you enormously and still feel fundamentally unknown, because what they value is a performance you have been sustaining so long you can no longer locate the performer. The applause is real. It just does not reach you, and it never will, because it is aimed at the wrong address. The way through is smaller than you would expect, and much more frightening. It is showing one unimpressive thing to one safe person. Not a confession, not a breakdown, not a dramatic unveiling. Something ordinary. Admitting you are tired without adding a reason, saying you do not know. Canceling something because you did not feel like going, and giving no justification. Asking for help you could technically manage alone. Each of these is an experiment, and each one gathers data your childhood never had access to. Some people will respond badly, and that information is valuable rather than devastating. Others will respond with a warmth that startles you, and you will not know where to put it, and it will feel like too much. Both outcomes teach you something you could not learn while performing. And both point toward one final question, the one this entire pattern was built to prevent you from asking. The worth you never had to earn. The question is this: what were you before you were useful? There was a period, however brief, before the contract, before you understood that attention was distributed by achievement, before you learned to read the room. A period in which you existed and required nothing to justify it, because that is the condition every human being begins in. You do not remember it, and its absence from memory is not evidence that it never happened. Consider what you already know to be true about worth in other contexts. Watch how you look at a sleeping child or an old dog or someone you love while they are ill and producing absolutely nothing. You do not calculate their value. You do not require output. The idea would strike you as obscene. Your capacity to see unconditional worth is entirely intact. You simply exempted yourself from it decades ago, and then forgot that the exemption was a decision made under pressure by someone very small. So this was never about learning to rest. Rest was a symptom. The actual work is the slow revision of a single sentence written into you before you could read. I am worth keeping only when I am producing. That sentence does not get deleted. It gets outvoted, gradually by experience, every time you sit still while the alarm sounds and nothing bad happens, every time you receive something without paying for it, every time someone sees the unimpressive interior and stays. Notice that this cannot be finished. There is no arrival, and looking for one would be the pattern reasserting itself, turning healing into another item on the ledger. What there is instead is a growing number of moments in which you exist without justification, and it is bearable, then unremarkable, then, eventually, quiet. You will probably keep working hard. That is not the enemy, and dismantling your capability is not the goal. The difference is the origin. Work that comes from desire, curiosity, and genuine care feels entirely unlike work that comes from debt, even when it produces identical results. And after some time, you will be able to tell them apart from the inside within seconds. So let this be the thing you sit with tonight, when you have finished everything and the guilt arrives right on schedule. You have spent your whole life trying to earn something that was never for sale. And the reason no amount of work ever settled the account is not that you have not done enough. It is that the debt was invented by someone who needed to survive a very long time ago. The question that remains is not whether you deserve to rest. It is how much longer you intend to keep paying a creditor who does not exist.